really liked the tone of it, really liked what you're trying to do. I like that you're trying to do philosophy in public, I think, which is one of the interesting things to me. And I think one of the things in the book, like that, I think when you said like that you actually, when you were younger, when you were a student, you said you wanted to be Socrates, and you actually went up to people. There is that kind of divide now that you have academic philosophy where you and I, we do papers and we do lectures and we talk to students and grad students, but we don't actually talk to people, real people. But you said you went outside the Art Institute in Chicago and you actually went up to people and asked them what is justice and what is truth and what is beauty. How did they find that? Or what was their responses, or what was the range of responses, I guess, Agnes, on that?
It didn't go well. They hated it, and they were afraid of me and confused by me, and kind of all of the people that I talked to. And I think that they just couldn't quite understand what I was up to. And it made me reflect on the way that the Socratic dialogues start. For instance, they never start the way I was starting at the Art Institute. That is, I actually just cold walk up to strangers being like, do you want to have a philosophical conversation? What's the meaning of life? Socrates tends to be introduced to the person that he's talking to. Sometimes there's even a little bit of a preamble on Socrates' weird philosophy thing that he does, like in the Laches, to sort of prepare. Or in the Gorgias, Socrates himself will do the preparation. This is my thing. And he will choose the question carefully for the interlocutor, right? So if he's talking to someone like, a general or something like that, he'll ask, what is courage? If he's talking to a child, like in Lysis, he might ask, do your parents really love you? If he's Alcibiades, right, who wants to rule the world, Socrates will ask, okay, what does it take to rule the world? What do you have to know in order to rule over people? And so he is tailoring his questions to people. So the encounters that he has are much more kind of particularized than the one I was trying to have.
Yeah. So also that interesting. You refer to the general the Laches, which was a general the Laches dialogue, and I think what you're saying there is it did. I think that took a lot of courage, Agnes, like just going up to asking strangers these questions. So I think that is in the dialogues, sort of courage is one of the enabling virtues, isn't it? It's like the thing that makes one of the other things possible. It makes the pursuit of truth possible, the pursuit of justice possible. The way I usually accomplish that was usually I go the symposium route when I need to talk to people. I get a little drunk, which was a part of it as well. Now, one of the things I liked about Open Socrates, your book, which is just out recently, Open Socrates, the Case for a Philosophical Life, to give it its full title. And it's a very, and I hope I'm getting this right, Agnes, it's a very sort of outward-looking book. Like Socrates' famous maxim, the unexamined life is not worth living. It's often taken to be quite inward-looking, quite introspective. And that your outward-looking approach, I think, chimes with my understanding of it. I always think of the unexamined life. Well, it can be inward-looking. It's certainly hard to look inside oneself. We find all types of horrible things when we look inside ourselves, like shame and moral limitation and self-disgust and biases and all types of things, right? But you're in some sense you think that. I think, maybe tell me if I'm getting this right, Agnes, if you think that philosophy is a kind of a therapy for that. Like when I said the unexamined life, that's why I started, which you're going up to strangers. It's kind of like an untested life as well. It's like, it's activities, it's just relations in the world. And you think the very purpose of philosophy or Socratic philosophy, the Socratic method is to act as some kind of therapy for that turn inwards. Would that be right? Have I got that right?
I think that it's right to say that the picture that I'm presenting tells you to turn outward rather than inward. I don't know that I would say that it's therapy. So I think, there's like one way to understand the idea of therapy is to say that there's sort of something that you're doing wrong, some way that you're wounded or something, and then you can be fixed. And the thought would be like, you're basically fine except for whatever this thing is, and we're going to fix that part. And I think that the Socratic approach suggests like you're not basically fine. That is, you're ignorant, right? There's just a really profound thing that really is wrong with you. And, sometimes I think even the word therapy suggests something like disabusing you of the notion that you're in any way imperfect or messed up or that you have anything to be guilty of. And Socratic method is about. It's about saying, no, you're right to think all those things. You really are as messed up as you think you are. It's just you're certainly not going to cure yourself through some meditation or self-reflection because you're the very person who's messed up. So the one who's doing the curing is the same one who needs the cure. And so on this sort of picture of philosophy, it is essentially social. And one way to put the sort of slogan, the book in slogan form, is that thinking is not something we can do by ourselves. Thinking is a social activity.
Right. And then that demands courage, that demands some kind of risk, some kind of, well, that was the other picture I always thought that struck me about your book, that there was a sense that you are, that it's a very sort of a provisional Socrates, if that's the right word, if I'm trying to communicate myself right, that things are up for grabs, things have to be worked out in communication with each other. And I will talk to you about sort of community competence and free speech and all those things later. But there's these two impulses, and I think you put it as light as the book in Socrates. There's the gadfly Socrates, and there's the midwife of knowledge Socrates. So there's the skeptic, and there's the person who wants to give birth to knowing. So how do we sort of reconcile those things? I guess what you're saying is that they're not reconcilable ultimately, that provisional questioning and interrogation continues.
I think that they get reconciled in the interaction. So, one thing I point out in one of the chapters of the book is that there are two ways in which Socrates gets described. And on the face of it, it looks like they're in tension with each other. So one of them is he's the famous gadfly. He is somebody who walks up to people and makes them feel like their mouth is numb and that they can't get the words out of their mouth. He takes away their pretensions to wisdom. He makes them feel bereft and, incapacitated in some way. And then there's Socrates' own depiction of himself in the Theaetetus as a midwife who's helping people give birth to ideas. So the gadfly looks like this kind of negative, critical, subtractive figure, whereas the midwife is this positive, nurturing, additive figure. And one of the questions that I ask is, like, how can he be both of those things? And the claim that I make is that Socrates can be a midwife together with, in the context of an interaction where he's being the gadfly and the other person is insisting on giving an answer, and sort of together they're inquiring into the truth. And so the midwife figure is really a product of the interaction that he has with another person. Sort of a way to think about it is like Socrates on his own is more of the gadfly, but combined with his interlocutor, he becomes a midwife.
I see. That kind of relates to the sort of the double ignorance problem then, doesn't it? Because just so people know, so double ignorance is the idea that in some sense, as you were saying, we're all ignorant, right? That's Socrates' idea, and sort of ignorance, but that ignorance is sort of constitutive of knowledge, is necessary to knowledge, or knowledge production, or knowledge generation. But we also don't know that we don't know, right, as well. And that then is, I think, where we get to the love of wisdom. So, like, I was just like, because I was reading up about bits and bobs on this, like on Socrates, trying to remind myself of it during the week. And like one of the, the famous Oracle of Delphi, the maxim, so that it declared that Socrates was the wisest of all people. And I think one of the things I was reading about was what Foucault had to say about that. And in Foucault's lectures on Socrates, The Courage of Truth, he says that what's really interesting about that is that Socrates, that marks a move from interpretation of what the oracle has to say to verification, to interrogation, to disputation, all those type of things. That's why Socrates is like such an exceptional figure in the history of philosophy. He's almost like a new event in sort of human civility and civilization, because rather, I don't know, like looking through the entrails of symbols from the divine or trying to guess them and interpret them, he's actually saying, oh no, we need to put this to the test. We need to try and figure out how we can turn what we don't know into something that we know that we don't know. That's the thing. That's the key, I think. Is that right, Agnes?
So I read it a little differently. I think that when Plato tells the story in the Apology of Socrates, his friend Chaerephon goes to this oracle, and the oracle gives him this piece of information, namely that there's no one who's wiser than Socrates, that Socrates finds incredible. He finds he just can't believe it. And he sort of spends the rest of his life, in some sense, flying in the face of that oracle, but ending up kind of proving it by trying to disprove it, that story prototype is meant to recall in the audience the story of Oedipus, because I just told the story of Oedipus. Right? This information from an oracle that he can't believe. He tries to disprove it, but he ends up proving it. And so what Plato is doing is retelling, in some way, the story of Oedipus through the story of Socrates, and they have a lot in common, but here's the difference between them. Oedipus does not try to interpret the oracle. He does try to refute it. He does try to dispute it, right? He's like, I'm gonna prove that this oracle is wrong. But because why does Oedipus go to the oracle? He goes to the oracle because, like, a guy at a bar tells him, I think maybe your dad's not your dad and your mom's not your mom. And he goes to the oracle and he's like, wait, are my parents my parents? And the oracle's like, we will kill your father and marry your mother. And Oedipus runs off, right? And not be like, wait, which ones are they, right? I mean, he could only ask that question. But he doesn't. He exactly doesn't do the thing that Plato describes Socrates as doing, which is to say, wondering to myself what riddle the oracle was riddling. What did it really mean? And so it's the fact that Socrates is willing to engage in something like an activity of interpretation by way of a kind of refutational activity. That's what distinguishes him from Oedipus. And that's what makes, I think, Plato is saying, Socrates' story a non-tragedy. That is, what Sophocles is saying about Oedipus is just we're all Oedipus, right? We're all in a position where we go through our lives and we don't know what we're doing and we just make a bunch of assumptions and run with those assumptions and then screw things up. And if we're lucky, we won't screw them up that much. And if we're unlucky, we'll screw them up really big like Oedipus did. But Oedipus screwed his life up not because he's so different from us, but he just got less lucky than the rest of us. And that's life, says the tragedian. And Plato's like, no, that's wrong. Your life doesn't have to go like that. You have agency over your life, but only if you actually try to figure out what's going on in your life. And so that's the sort of the case for the pursuit of knowledge.
And that's why, as well, I think that your Socrates, or the way you present Socrates, has this sort of universalist impulse. So that, that will separate your Socrates, say, from the Foucault that I just mentioned, or Nietzsche's Socrates. That in some sense, that I think, how did you put it? Socratic philosophy is radically non-exclusive, I think, is how you put it.
I'm not sure that in that way I differ so much from Nietzsche's Socrates. I think the fundamental way that I differ from the Socrateses that show up, let's say, for Kierkegaard or Nietzsche, I don't really know Foucault's Socrates. Those are parts of Foucault I haven't read. But is that Nietzsche's and Kierkegaard's Socrates are still fundamentally like Cicero's Socrates, which is to say a negative figure. Just the gadfly. They think he's just the gadfly.
Right.
I was going to say, no, he's also the midwife. That is, there's just a bunch of claims that Socrates establishes the truth of over the course of the dialogues. And if you take those claims and you put them together, they form a structure. They form a positive, like, edifice that you can use to live your life.
Yeah, that does it. Because I remember at the end of... I can't remember precisely where Nietzsche talks about this, but at the end of the Phaedo, when Socrates is about to die, and he's practically dead, he says the last thing, I need to please get a cock killed for Aesculapius. I hope I pronounced that right. And Nietzsche's like absolutely aghast at this, that like, why would he do this? Why would he, why would he like all of a sudden do something so stupid and absurd? And he misses out. And but that, I think what your point is sort of rather underlines that it's that it's just the gadfly basically, that the sort of that the masters of suspicion, that's their Socrates, rather than the Socrates who has that sort of productive element, that productive sort of interrogation, that constructive philosophy. But he's both, isn't he? He's both, which is your whole point.
So in his reading of that, this is the way it's usually read. I don't actually have a really settled reading of why Socrates says that, but the sort of standard reading that I'm guessing Nietzsche has is that Socrates wants to be grateful for having been cured of life. That is, in being about to die, he's cured of this disease, namely being alive. Because the Phaedo, the whole Phaedo has sort of set up this thing that, like, every pleasure and pain is a nail that rivets the soul to the body, and that what we're trying to do is free ourselves from our body, and that's what philosophy is. And that Socrates is grateful that he's being allowed to be liberated from his body. And I think that just really galls Nietzsche, right? Because Nietzsche is Mr. We got to embrace life. Life is so great. We got to have like a positive attitude towards life. And so I think that that's not just that's not just the gadfly issue. It's a special animus that Nietzsche has against a certain kind of, let's say asceticism that he correctly hears in that moment of the dialogue.
Yeah. So, well, let's try to talk about the more sort of like constructive version of thing, because one of the things that you talk about in the book is that this idea of the savage commands, and if there's Nietzsche's, as you say, is someone who says, like, you should probably embrace the savage commands. But let me just try and sort of summarize it. So the savage commands, there's two primary ones, as I understand it. There's the body, the impulse of the body, and the impulse of the group, effectively. So the body is desire, sex, food, shelter, and the impulse of the group is the injunction of the collective, say. Right, so it's philia, isn't it? So which you render as kinship in the book. So philosophy, then, the Socratic method, is what we do with those injunctions. I think would that be where we start? What we do with those imperatives, wherever they come from, whether they're. I think the obvious examples that you use in the book are the example of the body would be utilitarianism. Famously Bentham, the body has got two sovereign masters, pleasure and pain, and to which all else are subordinate. And the example of the group, which actually I thought was an really super interesting way you put it, was Kant, which was because like Agnes, Kant is always like the individualist, isn't he? He's like the self-legislator, the autonomous moral philosopher. I self-legislate and I follow the moral law. But you're saying, actually, no, it's actually about following the group, which is like, that's what Kant is. I make of myself a non-exception. So they're sort of the two contrasting impulses. And you're saying that Socrates is, in some way, trying to help us figure out what those injunctions, those imperatives, or philosophy is a task of trying to figure out how we respond.
So I think philosophy begins in the critique of those commands. So that's right. That is, Socratic philosophy begins there, right? So Socratic philosophy tries to show you that weakness of will is incoherent and revenge is incoherent. And weakness of will is like the characteristic failure mode of the bodily command, and revenge is the characteristic failure mode of the kinship command. And so it's right that philosophy begins in a critique of these commands, and then also right to say that ethical philosophy develops by trying to kind of reconstitute the command in a better form through the addition of rationality and universalization, where in the case of the bodily command, the form that rationality takes is maximizing and calculative, whereas in the case of the kinship command, the form that rationality takes is sort of legislative, regulative of like a pre-existing maxim, say, right? You're subjecting the maxim to a rule. Okay. And so it's right to say that philosophy develops these two sources of automatic answers to the question, what should I do? Which is what savage commands are. But I think that Socrates wants to propose something else, something additional for philosophy to do. Namely, in addition to sort of polishing up these answers that you got for free, you could actually just try to find answers. Like you could just ask the question, what should I do? That's a substitute for saying accepting this or that automatic answer or polishing up or improving the automatic answers that you've got. And so I think that's why I think Plato picks up on that from Socrates when he says, well, the soul has three parts. It has an appetitive part that is governed by the bodily command. It has a spirited part that is governed by the kinship command. But then it's got this rational part, right? That's the part that the philosopher is making use of in trying to inquire about how to live. And the thought is that even though in certain types of personality, all that the rational part will ever do is be enslaved by one of the other two parts and be forced to do its bidding, there is a world in which the rational part does its own bidding, in which it sets its own ends. And that's the activity of philosophy.
So would it be right then to say that the activity of philosophy is trying to parse the difference between pseudo ends and more meaningful ends or authentic ends? Is that right?
Yeah, I think that it's trying to make sure that the ends that you act on really are good,
that they matter, and that they're connected to things which are of significance and importance.
Right. Like, I start the book by talking about Tolstoy and this sort of midlife crisis that he had, where he looked around at all the things that he spent his time pursuing. And they're things that seem obviously significant, like some of the greatest novels that have ever been written, the welfare of the peasants who live around him, bringing of his children in this big family. He cared about things that were like, yeah, that was good. You were doing good, Tolstoy.
He did all right, yeah.
And he's like, no, none of this matters. I should kill myself. That is what he realizes, is that he kind of has been taking for granted what he's supposed to pursue and hasn't actually asked the question, like, well, why should I pursue these things? What significance do they really have for me in the face of certain death?
In some sense, this is very Socratic, isn't it? Sort of the external ends, like he says to Alcibiades, and Alcibiades is swayed by external ends like wealth, power, fame, repute, and Tolstoy he's got one of the best writers who's ever lived, and he's wealthy and he's got all these people to look after, but those external ends are in some sense lesser, or they're not as momentous for his life. In a way, and that's in some sense philosophy. He's getting to a philosophical position, Tolstoy. Basically, he's getting to the Socratic position, and it's interesting. He does become ascetic, doesn't he? He becomes sort of kind of a Christian socialist, Tolstoy.
Yeah, he becomes kind of like a cult hero, cult leader, right? People like following him around. But he doesn't really become a philosopher. I think that the conclusion that he comes to is that sort of finding a way to set these kind of questions aside by way of something like religious faith is really the only viable route. So I think it's like he walked right up to the doorway of philosophy and then just kind of didn't walk through it. It was like, how do we close this door?
which is what Socrates, which is what all the interlocutors in the dialogue do to Socrates. Like, you are so annoying, Socrates.
Right, so it's easy because they can just be like, oh, all I got to do is walk away from Socrates, right? But Tolstoy had the bug inside him, and he couldn't walk away from himself, and that's why he was so tortured.
Okay, so Tolstoy sort of becomes ascetic. Socrates there's a strain of asceticism in Socratic work, especially sort of in the Phaedo, as we were discussing. Now, one of the things that, and I hope I'm getting this right here, is that a function of philosophy or the Socratic method is, and this is a word that comes up a lot, like these savage commands are, and akrasia is the word I think that you use, which you translate as weakness of will, I guess, that's a conventional translation of it. So the idea is that philosophy so the savage commands make us waver. That's the word that you use a lot in the book, I think. And in some sense, philosophy helps us to become unwavering. I hope I'm not putting that too simplistically, or
that's right. Let's put it that way. I would say less wavering.
Less wavering, yeah. So if I put it in sort of the existential, like, get my Heidegger hat on, I'm teaching Heidegger at the moment, sort of resolute, more steadfast, perhaps. That would be either, or so more steadfast in the face of life's uncertainty. Is that right?
I think that, it's not life's uncertainties, it's our uncertainties. There's a funny thing, like, there's a funny kind of hardness, I think, about the ethical position that I'm putting forward, Socratic intellectualism, where what I mean is that a lot of us go through life thinking, look, life's pretty tough. It puts you in challenging situations. Like, there can be tragic choices. There can be, we just don't have enough information. And like, Life throws us in circumstances that we don't necessarily know how to navigate because life is hard. And the Socratic view is that's all wrong. Life is fine. There's no problem with life. There's a problem with you. That is, you don't know stuff and you're trying to navigate a situation while being ignorant. And the problem is you, right? All along it's been in you. Life is not especially difficult. Life is constantly presenting you with choices that are like the following. Would you like $100 or $1,000? That's what life is doing. And it's like, just pick the $1,000 every time and it'd be good. The reason why it looks different to you, the reason why it looks like life is saying, well, here's like a cookie that tastes good now, or here's like not eating a cookie, but you'll feel better later. And then you're torn between them. The reason it looks like that is that you're confused, is that you're being sort of bullied by the bodily command that doesn't know what it's doing.
Gosh, no wonder people don't like us, Agnes. If we put these questions to people, like no one, and no, I mean, Plato's dialogues, the other dialogues, they dramatize this, don't they? That everyone thinks that this guy's an idiot. Like Socrates will ask a question like, I don't know, like, what's a friend? Or, how many friends do you have? Or is it better to have more friends than dogs or something like that? Which sounds absurd. Everyone goes, God, this guy's a moron. This guy's an idiot, Yet no one actually wants to answer those questions, or nobody, although answering those questions or engaging with those questions is a kind of a prerequisite for living a philosophical life.
I don't think it's quite right to say nobody wants to answer them. So I think that Socrates was a very high variance person. So on the one hand, some people, when they encountered him, they were like, this is the worst guy I've ever met in my life. We got to kill him. And eventually that group won out, right? And they did kill him. On the other hand, there were a whole bunch of people who were like, I have to spend not only the rest of my life, but the rest of all my descendants' lives remembering this guy. Let me do that by like writing a bunch of texts that like depict him in conversation so that he never gets forgotten. And he basically gets like a cult following, and we get a whole literary genre, the Socratic dialogue, that springs into being from Socrates. Okay, most of them were lost. But we have Plato, we have Xenophon. And so we have, he was this incredibly compelling person. He was a person who asked you questions you felt like you actually needed to answer. Right. And so he was just both of those things at the same time. He was both revolting and compelling.
Yeah. Well, I think probably one of the things that is good about your book is that you show like that how blooming hard it can be to do that, and sometimes we might want to take the easy way out. Now, speaking of the easy way out, the political dimension of your book, in the latter part of the book, you deal with things like equality or egalitarianism, social justice, and free speech. And the free speech element I thought was really super interesting, because you said that, and if I got this right, so free speech is only free speech when it is a sort of philosophical speech, or it's inquisitive speech is what you're saying. And you also say the same, art works in a sort of a similar way. Could you perhaps try to fill that picture in?
Sure. So the thing I start by doing is try to say, I think free speech is something we care about. Okay, something important to us. And then I try to say, okay, what is it? Like, what is our best theory of free speech? And I consider a bunch of contenders, right? So is it just like the First Amendment of our Constitution of the United States, right? Is that what we mean by free speech? No, it's clearly not, right? Even within the United States context, quite often people feel that their speech is unfree, even though the government is not interfering in any way. So that's not going to work. That is, the government is not the end all and be all of the question of free speech. And then I say, okay, how about the marketplace of ideas? Like, is that the idea? Is that there's just a bunch of ideas out there? And I explain why I think that doesn't work. I then talk about persuasion, right? Is free speech when changes of mind happen by way of persuasion? And I explain why that doesn't work. And then I talk about what about debate? Maybe debate is what we need right now. So what I do is I take what I consider to be like the best contenders for an account of free speech, and I show how they don't work. And then I offer an alternative, and I show that it captures the territory you want captured, even though it's not going to seem intuitive to most of my readers to say free speech is inquisitive speech. But that's what I want to claim. I want to claim that what makes speech free is that it has the power. It has the capacity to move towards the truth. That is, it's free speech is important to beings like us who don't have knowledge yet. And what we need is the freedom to acquire knowledge. And so free speech is going to require a lot more than people not telling you to shut up. Because you could very well be in a context in which nobody told you to shut up. And in fact, in a context in which everybody listened to you and everybody automatically agreed with you, you still wouldn't have free speech, on my view. If they didn't push back against you, your speech would not be free because you would not have any hope of inquiring. So yeah, that's free speech.
Yeah, that's interesting. So like it's so it has to be free speech is free. So it's not coerced then, because when it's motivated by a move towards philosophical truth or towards inquiry or towards deliberation. They have to be sort of necessary conditions of making free speech free or meaningful free speech. Perhaps would that be right?
Yeah, a way to think about it is imagine that there's a king. And he can say whatever he wants. No one's ever going to stop him. In fact, everyone that he says anything to is going to agree with it. Right? Oh, yes, King. For sure, King. Is his speech free? And I think Socrates would say, no, it's coerced. It's coerced by flattery. That is, it's not the obvious kind of coercion, but most of the coercion that we exert on one another is non-obvious coercion because we're sensitive to coercion, so we're tricky about it. And we mostly manipulate each other through flattery. And so if speech is going to be really free, we're going to need more than just we're not going to shoot you if you say something. We're also going to we're not going to flatter you if you say something false.
Yeah. Well, that begs another question then. So sorry to keep banging on about Foucault. I really shouldn't have read up on it during the week. It's just kind of looming large. Like, does that mean that free speech has to be connected to a type of truth telling? Rather than the king who's getting flattered, but there has to be sort of parrhesia, I think is what Foucault calls it. The idea that exactly, that there has to be attached to free speech. There has to be a pursuit of truth that you say, or you deliver unpalatable truth, perhaps, unlike the king's flatterers.
So I think that, even the king is trying to speak the truth. He's not just randomly saying stuff, right? He's saying things that he thinks are true. The problem with the king is not that he doesn't get to try to speak the truth. The problem with the king is that he doesn't get to inquire. That is, he doesn't get to find out whether the things that he's putting forward as true really are true. And I agree with you that the flatterers might just not care about the truth at all. Like, they care about not having their heads chopped off. But yes, so I think that it's inquisitive speech, which is speech that aims to be figuring out whether the things you think are true really are true, that's free speech.
And then, in addition to that, I guess it has to be, and this is your broader point, I think, in the book, that it has to be connected to the good, to the pursuit of the good as well. So fighting injustice, which is something you talk about egalitarianism, social justice, or the pursuit of social justice, social good, and free speech. And what's one of the things that I've thought absolutely fascinating, Agnes, in the book was that when we're fighting injustice, you say, well, there seems to be something performative about that when we do it, or there is a distorted or perhaps defective mode of fighting injustice, and I think everybody must notice that it's that sort of inner temptation we have to refute, which is your point, that other person bad, other idea bad. Like, I don't know, I'm a liberal, conservatism is bad because I'm a conservative, socialism is bad, and that the pursuit of the good is mistaken for the refutation of things I find morally distasteful.
Yes, I think that, but I wouldn't even use the word refutation. That is, I think that often people don't care whether they're really refuting, but they care whether they're defeating. So they have a set of views that they think are wrong, and they want to score symbolic victories against those views. For instance, by making the people who hold the views look stupid. That's not refuting. It's not necessarily, they might be well aware they haven't refuted the view. They don't mind. Socrates thinks if only they cared about refuting the views, then we'd be home free. So it is that we transpose the disagreement into a new context, where in that context, what we have is like a zero-sum game with a winner and a loser, and then they're trying to be the winner in that zero-sum game.
Well, this is really interesting as well then, because it would suggest that the Socratic mode is something that, and I think this probably moves it away from the Homeric tradition, the idea of the agonistic tradition. So sorry, agonistic. So as listeners know, it's the idea of things as contest or a game. Again, which Nietzsche would have very much loved, or Machiavelli, the idea that that the truth is produced through contest. So in some sense, you're saying that philosophy is a different kettle of fish, basically. So put it in banal terms, it's a different activity to that point scoring, or all of the internet, basically, as we now know it.
Yes, so I think that's right. I think that quite often Socrates is trying to get something across to his interlocutor, and it's like, it's so simple. It's such a simple point that it's almost unsayable. He's trying to say, Gorgias, this thing that we're doing right now, it's happening for real. This isn't a game. There's nothing we're trying to win. Like, this is it. This is life right now. It's us trying to figure this thing out. And Gorgias is like, oh, so you're trying to make me look bad so I get like fewer students of oratory, whatever.
Status, yeah.
Exactly. And Socrates is like, no, this is it. Like, this is the end goal of everything else. And we're just doing it here and now. And we could just be figuring out, like, what is oratory? What's under discussion between them at that moment. And so I think that there's a lot of life that involves playing games. A lot of sort of status is about playing games. That is, there are things that stand for. I noticed this recently. I was on a flight, and if you get a certain kind of high status on the airplane, you get to board first, and you have a seat already. You have a seat assignment, right? And you might have thought it would be punishment to have to board first and sit there on that plane instead of you sit in the waiting area, which is generally more space and you can buy food or whatever. But we somehow just decided that getting to board the plane first is high status. We could have decided that getting to board last was high status, and that the most fancy person is like, I don't board until everyone else is on the plane, and I can get to the airport later because I'm the last
I
boarder.
just swish in and I look fantastic. Everyone's going to look at me. Yeah.
Right. Like, we could so easily imagine that, right? But we just assigned one of these positions, first boarder or last boarder. We assigned one of them to high status, and that's like a little game that we're playing. And Socrates doesn't have any particular opposition to those games. He gets that life is filled with games. It's just he thinks, yeah, but there's also real life, and this is it. This is real life.
So not a game, then. Not a game. It should be. We should. So a game is always, in a very basic sort of phenomenological sense, it's something that's separated off. Like, you do games over there, or it's located. Yeah, but Socrates talk about everything. Everything. Life is not a game. It's serious. It has gravity.
Right. I think that one thing that's sort of shocking about that is that a lot of people think of philosophy as kind of a game. Like, oh, you're doing this fun little verbal bantering activity or something. No, the whole rest of your life is a game. This is the real part. This is the part where you're actually living.
Which makes sense, because Socrates, I don't know what you think, Agnes, he doesn't debate much in the dialogues, does he? There's not a lot of debating, like, it's where one person has a position and the other person has a position, and there's a set of adjudicators who figure out which is the most persuasive. It's not like that at all. It's devastatingly simple. Like, I went out for a walk this morning, and I was trying to think, like, how would I explain Socrates to my daughter who's 7? And I was like going, it's really simple. It's like he just asked me questions about important stuff. What do you think? Do you know? Is this true? So on top of that, then So I think one of the more sort of positive elements of your book is that when he's doing that, when he's asking those questions of those people, there's an opening there for when he's putting norms into questions, when he's putting conventions and pieties into question. There's an opening there for some kind of a collective experience, I think. Now, I don't mean like collective politically necessarily, but I think your point was that it's. I think you put it in terms of sort of a quest, like a shared quest for knowledge, for interrogation, sort of a shared enterprise. Philosophy is one of the things that allows us to do an important shared enterprise. That's not trivial.
Yes, I think that's right. So first, just going back to debate, I think that Socrates is, I think, against debate. That is, in the Gorgias, he explains why he doesn't want the conversation that he's having with Polus to be structured as a debate where, like, there's an audience judging which of the two of them is correct. And why? Well, I think he thinks that debate is a way of politicizing argument. That is, it takes an argument, it takes a disagreement, and it maps it onto this contest where there's a winner and a loser. And Socrates is like, we don't care about that. We care about the answer to the question. Is it better to do injustice or suffer it or something like that, whatever they're discussing. And so what he says, the way that I think Socrates thinks is that the problem with a debate is that in a debate there are two positions. So, one of us is pro-choice and one of us is pro-life or something like that. But in a Socratic exchange, there's only one position, namely the interlocutors, and it's being examined by Socrates. That is, one position is sort of having its day in the sun and getting to be thoroughly examined, rather than people making like contrary speeches to one another. And I think that, to get to your second point, I think that's what Socrates thought people could do together. So that there's a way in which in a debate, the two people they're each off on their own island of thought, right? But they're not really collaborating. But that in a Socratic interrogation, when Socrates is asking someone questions about their view, they're working together to inquire into the truth of the matter. And he thinks that's the most fundamental way that human beings can work together. So, yeah, it is the fundamental form of collaboration.
And that's then what, that then connects to the good as well, because that's what allows us to think about ways of making ourselves better or more, productive is probably not a right word, or maybe allow us to flourish more, because at least then those things are in question. Now, one of the things I wanted to ask you was, I think I've read elsewhere that sort of you identify as a political liberal, whatever that means necessarily, but one of the things of the Socratic impulse is that you have to sort of question your priors or one's own political sentiments, and that's it. There's I suppose, Socrates is anti-utopian, but I can't ultimately commit to my own idea of liberalism, or I can't ultimately commit to my own idea of socialism or conservatism or whatever, right? So I'm just trying to think that does lead to sort of a degree of loneliness, doesn't it? Not necessarily for you or an individual, but for philosophers in general, who follow the Socratic path, because even if it is a sort of a collective enterprise, we do in some sense always have to forego our tribal affiliations, our kinship affiliations, or our political tastes, or our political preferences, or even there's just the things that we think are politically just, that in some sense we always have to sort of set them aside, because we always have to go and then there's another question, and then, which is why I suppose people find Socrates frustrating. But yeah, sorry, I'll let you respond to that.
So I think that Socrates thought that, I think I don't know that I've ever said that I identify as a liberal, but I suppose that I do. In the sense that I see the core values of liberalism as, freedom of speech, equality, and justice. And I explain the sense in which I believe in those values in the book. So that's fair enough. But I think that Socrates thought that those sort of tribal affiliations didn't really cut against loneliness. That is, that actually we can, and you can sort of see that today, right? People are very tribal, they're very polarized, but they're very lonely.
Yep.
It's not as though, being very agitated about making sure that everyone online knows your political identity protects you from loneliness. And I think Socrates thought that loneliness was a very serious problem and that philosophy has to address it. He's maybe one of the few philosophers who takes the problem of loneliness seriously. And I think that's to be said in his favor, because I think it's one of the fundamental problems in human life. But he thought that in order to escape loneliness, you have to find a way to connect with people. It's not enough just that people are there, but you have to connect with them. And we have to find what's the real way, what's the deepest way to connect with them. And I think the Phaedo is supposed to be a demonstration of the thought that, when Socrates is near death and he really needs his friends to be there for him, the way in which he wants them to be there for him is that they engage in an inquiry into the question of whether the soul is really immortal.
Also, in addition to that, there is a sense that I think that the other inquirer is not someone trivial, or it's not someone who is part of a game, or it's not just a debate, but it's also someone who is a philosopher. your interlocutor of the dialogue is another philosopher. It's someone who is minded and who is that the best way to sort of incorporate them. And I think you say this in the book, in fact, that that when you ask philosophical questions of people, like, all of a sudden they go like, oh, why would I be able to answer that? Like, but in some sense, their input is, as irrespective of the content of what they might have to say, their input into a dialogue, into the activity of inquiry or shared inquiry, is what connects us, I suppose. Agnes, is that right?
It's right that they've got to be a philosopher, but from Socrates' point of view, that doesn't mean that you pre-select your interlocutors, you find the philosophers and only talk to them. What it means is you got to turn everyone into a philosopher, right? So he even says to Gorgias, right? Gorgias is an orator. He's like, Gorgias, we can continue our conversation if you're the same kind of man as I am. And then he goes on and explains what he means by that. What he means is you're a philosopher. So it's like, I need you to be a philosopher, at least for the duration of this conversation. And one of Socrates' gifts was the ability to turn other people into philosophers.
Yeah, like in the Meno with the kid. Yeah, and
Exactly.
So, folks, listen, in the Meno, Socrates helps a slave solve Pythagoras' theorem, basically, through demonstration, through probing questions. There is something really... There is, like, even in his person, the Socratic person, I know there's all the caricatures of him, and the caricature is the point, like, we don't really know what he looked like, but we have all these different accounts, and he's sort of got bulbous eyes, and he's fat, and he's got a beard, and he's supposed to be quite scruffy. There is sort of something sort of absurd about him as well. They're clearly very charming about him, as you say. He eventually sort of has a sort of a cult of following. There is that sense that absurdity is retained in Socrates, a degree of, I suppose, like, I won't say stupidity, but then again, he does, right? He says, the wisest person is the person who knows they know nothing, right? That they know the problem of double ignorance. That's the cure to it, that I can understand that uncertainty and ignorance is part of becoming wise.
Yeah, at one place, more than one place, I believe, he either gets describes himself in this word in Greek atopos or atopotatos, which means, like, literally means somebody who doesn't have a place, but it means like really weird, just very, very strange, very unusual. And I think Socrates understood that he was very strange, and the people around him took him to be very strange. And, his appearance was part of that, his manner, his not wearing shoes. He was just a very, very strange person. But in a way, the strange things about his strangeness was that he kind of turned it into this universality, into this universal persona that anyone can imitate.
Yes. So there is that sort of the universal impulse in him as well. And he did. I think I can't remember exactly which dialogue it was in, but I think did he say in a beauty contest that he was? I think it was with Alcibiades. Sorry, I neglect to remember, but he said, like, I should win a beauty contest because I have inner beauty. I think that's pretty funny. Okay, so I think I've got one more last question. So we started talking about the Phaedo, and the question of death looms large throughout Open Socrates. That's probably one of the most savage of all commands, isn't it? It's a question of double ignorance as well. We know we're going to die, but we don't know how. We don't know about how we're going to die or how it's going to affect us. But in Plato's dialogues, right? In Plato's Phaedo, which is a funereal text. It's the last days of Socrates, and Socrates he meets with all his friends, and he drinks the hemlock and he dies. And one of the questions I wanted to ask you specifically about that, and although one of the interesting things about that, Agnes, is Plato is absent actually in that. Plato, which I think is quite noteworthy, because he doesn't want to face down the mortality of his beloved friend and mentor. But and then he gives us the Republic as the answer to that. But that's just a sort of a digression.
Or he wanted to be free in writing the text the way he wanted to write it. So he's like, look, I wasn't there. I don't know exactly what happened. Here's my story.
Well, that's, good artistic license. Yeah. Clever. That's almost cynical, that. But so the question though I wanted to ask is, at the end of the Phaedo, Socrates dies, and it's a really great writing. He says, what does he say at the end of the Phaedo? He talks about the cock, which we were mentioning. He says, please sacrifice a cock. And he says to his other friend, I can't remember which one it was, he says, what do you have anything? Just look after each other. just look after each other. And that's the best thing you could probably do. And but what I want to ask you specifically, Agnes, is in the Phaedo, in what sense for you does Socrates die? Is his immortality literal, or is his immortality more connected to something about renown, or leaving a legacy, or that the task will be to sort of to continue philosophy after his passing?
Well, it sort of depends on who we're referring to, right? So I think that like the word Socrates refers to, on the one hand, a historical individual who, was in fact put to death in 399 BC by the city of Athens. But it also refers to a character in Plato, right? That's the character in the Phaedo. The historical Socrates can't show up in the Phaedo because it's not some kind of a record, right? It's a sort of literary retelling of something. So there's the literary character in Plato. There's the literary character in Xenophon. But I think that the Socrates we're really interested in is not any of those three Socrateses. I think that Socrates, the historical individual, as he lived his life, he lived it in the light of this imagined self-representation of who he could be. And that kind of persona, that was Socrates. That is, he spent his whole life trying to be Socrates. And part of the reason why people like Plato and Xenophon were, creating the literary character of Socrates is that they were interested in that ideal Socrates that the historical Socrates lived his life in the light of. They wanted to capture that. And I think that really does live on. That is, it lives on, it's just not an accident that even in a law school, people refer to the method of questioning as the Socratic method. That there's a sense in which Socrates made himself a permanent part of our intellectual landscape.
Okay, thanks very much, Agnes. That's a brilliant place to end.
Okay.